The point of addressing this trend in Banjo-Tooie's mechanics is actually a fairly central one. Much of the level design in Banjo-Tooie is largely driven by the need to ensure that levels are navigable with all of the different playable characters. I could spend quite a while discussing all of the worlds in Banjo-Tooie and their relative strengths and flaws. But in the interest of time, I'll instead give a brief examination of the two that are most affected by this consideration. I don't feel it's a coincidence that these two levels also happen to be my least favorite and favorite levels in the game. Terrydactyl Land is effectively the halfway point of Banjo-Tooie. By this point, individual jiggies have become much more complicated and difficult to collect. Many of this level's jiggies center around switching between playable characters. On that note, Terrydactyl Land is also the only level to feature two different versions of its transformation, in the form of a child and adult T-Rex. Although switching between the two can be a bit tedious, as it involves changing to Mambo and watching a cutscene before switching back to Banjo and Kazooie, I do like the idea, and it does have some interesting applications. The adult T-Rex gives a satisfying feeling of weight and power. Learning how to roar from a once hostile enemy is a neat addition, and the animation quality and sheer size of the adult T-Rex model is fairly impressive. All that being said, the adult T-Rex is a major factor in making Terrydactyl Land one of the worst levels in Banjo-Tooie. This has less to do with the T-Rex itself, and more to do with what its presence necessitates from the level design. From a level themed around the age of dinosaurs, a player might expect a little more variety in terms of environment. Perhaps a dense jungle area, a swamp surrounded by foliage, and some wide-open grasslands. Instead, the main area of Terrydactyl Land is sprawling, bland, and almost entirely empty. And though I'm partially speculating, I feel this has a lot to do with the adult T-Rex transformation. Even as bloated in size and sparse as the outer area is, the T-Rex sometimes barely has the room to move around. This would suggest that many of the level's features were designed or altered specifically to fit this one transformation idea, resulting in the scale of the level in general being increased dramatically. As a result, what could have been an interesting and varied level is almost entirely a beige, empty wasteland. Nearly every object of interest is concentrated on the edges of the main area. This, along with a combination of a lack of color and variance in the environment, makes much of the traversable terrain feel useless and boring. In addition, moving around the level as Banjo, and especially as Mambo, feels tedious. This is in sharp contrast to the game's usual fast and fluid platforming style, which, even in the larger areas, at least introduces some variance to the shape of terrain and overall look of the environment. The homogenized, flat appearance of Terrydactyl Land's main area also makes the level more difficult to navigate. The circular layout and an almost total lack of landmarks makes it very easy to become disoriented. Especially frustrating is the fact that every cave entrance looks basically identical. The addition of, for example, cave drawing style icons alongside each entrance would have simultaneously made navigation easier, while adding consistent visual flair that matches the level's theme. The fact that such a simple and beneficial addition wasn't made when so many other details in the game seem carefully considered is confusing to say the least. The plodding, methodical music feels appropriate for a dinosaur-themed world, but if anything, it's a little too on the nose. The sluggish pace only seems to emphasize the tedious feeling of wandering aimlessly through the too large outer area. As we can see from levels like Witchy World and the ocean in Jolly Roger's Lagoon, this slow tempo could have been alleviated through the use of a stronger and more memorable melody. Instead, the low droning brass is drowned out by the bass line and the strange animal sound effects. Even when the brass is replaced by a xylophone in the cave areas, it only serves to highlight just how repetitive and uninteresting the melody is. Repetition can be a useful musical tool, but the entire first half of the song consists of the same 8 bars played 4 times in a row. Splitting it into 13-second pieces and playing all 4 of them simultaneously highlights just how little variance there is. In general, I would call myself an enthusiastic fan of Grant Kirkhope's work, but in Terrydactyland he definitely misses the mark. The level also features some of the most lengthy jiggies in the game. Helping the Styracosaurus family involves traveling by train between Terrydactyland, Witchy World, and the Overworld, and requires switching to Mumbo twice. I feel it's a reasonable estimate to assume that new players would likely spend the better part of an hour or more, all for a single jiggy. This makes for a fairly disappointing reward, a fact that's actually noted by the developers in the form of dialogue from Kazooie. Arguably worse is rescuing Terry's children, which repeatedly moves the goalposts. A player who finds and attempts to hatch the eggs without defeating Terry will simply be told that they can't do it yet, which feels like an arbitrary waste of time. After defeating Terry and hatching the last of the eggs, the player then has to switch to Banjo and carry the last baby up to the top of the mountain. This is another fairly needless diversion. The intent seems to be to bring the player to where the jiggy spawns, but other jiggies in the game are simply added to the player's inventory automatically, such as yet another terribly paced and terribly conveyed jiggy in Terrydactyland. Filling up this dinosaur's pool of water ends up being quite similar to the Jolly Roger's Lagoon jiggy I discussed earlier. The dialogue used to introduce the problem isn't just vague, it's completely contradictory. And just as before, the player has no agency in discovering or deducing the solution themselves, and instead stumble into it accidentally in the final level. Typically, when I offer criticism of a game, I try to also suggest ways in which it could be improved. When it comes to Terrydactyland, its greatest flaw is simply the design of its main area. With that in mind, I took it upon myself to make a few changes. My priority was to rearrange the existing structures into something that perhaps works a little more effectively, while keeping completely new additions to a minimum. Click on the annotation for a more detailed breakdown of my choices and my justifications for them. Foregoing a total structural change, a simple path allowing the player to cut through the central mountain that crossed in the center would have been a very useful addition by dividing the level more distinctly and making traversal somewhat easier. Better placement of the warp pads would also be helpful, as 3 of them are all clustered in roughly the same area. Ultimately, Terrydactyland did have some interesting ideas that were executed well on their own. However, sticking to the novelty of those ideas and failing to account for the impact of that novelty on the level's overall design is its downfall. It boasts a few impressive set pieces, but has far too much wasted space, looks incredibly bland, and fails to live up to its potential visually or thematically. What I believe to be Banjo-Tooie's strongest level is an unexpected choice, even for myself. When I recorded footage for this review, I actually dreaded playing it, only to find that it quickly became my favorite. That level is Grunty Industries. Although other levels in the game may be more emblematic and may have more appealing themes, I don't feel that any level suits Tooie's central design tenets better than this one. It's often described as among Banjo-Tooie's more frustrating and convoluted worlds, but I think it's gotten a far worse reputation than it deserves. I can't deny that the level certainly has some issues. Perhaps most notable are the tin-top sentries, which strike me as a fairly lazy way to fill in empty areas with persistent hazard. Although I like that it's possible to disable them temporarily by destroying the security cameras respawn far too quickly, and the consequence for being spotted is a bit too severe, as the tin tops can fly anywhere and spawn infinitely. The level's sheer size also poses a problem, as it can be more than a little overwhelming for a new player. Playing the game again, however, I realized the degree to which Grunty Industries uses its enormous size to its advantage. It does this through the establishment of a consistent theme in its design. Right off the bat, Grunty Industries demonstrates that it's a very different kind of level by presenting the player with a closed door, preventing direct entry. Instead, the player enters via the train station. At first, this might seem circuitous and perhaps even frustrating. To me, this is a fantastic way to introduce the level's theme. Its primary intent, rather than to introduce challenge through more powerful enemies and dangerous hazards, is to constrain the player's free movement as much as possible. From the closed-door introduction, to the battery-operated doors, to the constant use of switch-activated gates, it seems like most aspects of its design speak to this intent. And again, at first, this might seem like a negative point, especially considering that I just finished criticizing Terrydactyland for being difficult to navigate. The difference is that in Terrydactyland, the tedium in navigation was an artifact of another feature's inclusion. Grunty Industries instead integrates all of these movement constraints as problems that the player solves in the course of completing the level. The more the player explores and traverses, the more it opens up, introducing shortcuts and warp points at nearly every turn. It has a great deal of traversable terrain, but unlike other large levels in the game, it's much more condensed, with warp pads and elevator shafts typically not too far away at any given time. As a result, every time a gate is opened or a warp point is activated, it feels like a minor accomplishment. To me, most other levels in Banjo-Tooie feel like little more than themed backdrops for the actual content. This is fine, and to many other players it may likely be preferable, but Grunty Industries feels like the only level that the player directly interacts with on a larger scale. Nearly everything the player does involves breaking down or opening up barriers to the player's movement, or circumventing and outsmarting the complex factory's normal operation. It gives a distinct feeling of triumph to gradually dismantle and disable set pieces until the player's goal is attainable. The level in and of itself feels like a puzzle that needs to be solved, and gradually the player transforms it from a closed-off, obtuse mess into another open-world playground. An important aspect of this is the fact that, unlike many other levels, the player can actually make observations about their surroundings to accomplish this. Noticing a doorway that leads outside on the clearly marked second floor, the player can then accurately locate a window outside that leads to their destination. When an object of interest is hanging from the ceiling, the player can deduce that unscrewing a panel on the floor above can put that object within reach. This kind of observation extends to the differences between each playable character as well. The limitations and strengths afforded to Banjo-Kazooie and the washing machine transformation in getting from place to place provide an incentive for the player to consider the level from more than just their current perspective. Understanding these limitations and finding ways to work around them is an integral part of Grunty Industries. No other level makes such extensive use of the differences between each playable character in such a natural-feeling way. Even the more arbitrary barriers are given a believable context through the use of the factory manager. This character takes over for Jam Jars in explaining why the washing machine can't use the warp pads, and why Banjo and Kazooie can't enter certain doors or use the service elevator. In any context other than being micromanaged by the operator of an industrial factory, these limitations would be far more frustrating and confusing. By giving a face to these game constructs, they instead feel like another piece of the level's theme. The player is made to feel that they're now in hostile territory, and have to play by at least some of the enemy's rules in order to succeed. Something I found particularly interesting was the acceleration of my progression. It took me over an hour to get my first Jiggy, but just under an hour and a half later, I'd accomplished everything that was possible in a player's first visit to the level. This feels like another consequence of the level's central design theme, where progress toward one goal will often also help with another, usually by way of shortcuts and other aids in navigation being made available in the process. It's a very satisfying aspect that adds to the feeling of growth, as the player starts to effortlessly overcome what was once an especially daunting world. Its music is another strong point. Grant Kirkhope takes a great melody and adapts it to multiple environments in a masterful way. Outside the building, loud, harsh brass and percussion mix with the rain to create an imposing cacophony. Inside the building, the song is much more subdued, using synths to create an electronic, mechanized feel. In the depths of the factory, the music is even quieter still, with soft instrumentation and continuous strings in the background adding a degree of tension. This use of changing volume and intensity to reflect the change in environment is nothing new for the Banjo series, but it works particularly well in Grunty Industries, effectively imparting the feeling of delving deeper and deeper into a massive industrial labyrinth as the music outside grows ever quieter. Grunty Industries is a polarizing level, and it's certainly not perfect. But of all the worlds in Banjo-Tooie, none of them complement the multiple character mechanics on quite the same level as this one. This strikes an incredible contrast with Terrydactyland, where the exact same mechanics had huge negative implications on its design. In fact, Grunty Industries feels like the polar opposite of Terrydactyland in many respects. Both are large levels, but Grunty Industries makes a far more effective use of its size. Despite being more complex, Grunty Industries is much better at using visuals to aid in navigation, with prominent signage in nearly every area. The color coding of each floor is a slightly more subtle but still effective way to convey the player's location. Both levels feature multiple jiggies that involve switching between playable characters, but the addition of a time limit in Grunty Industries immediately eliminates any sense of tedium, and rewards players with a better working knowledge of how to get around the level efficiently. In short, Terrydactyland and Grunty Industries highlight how much care needs to be taken when allowing the player to control multiple characters with different properties. Terrydactyland's changes in the level design to suit one character at the expense of the others drastically changed the overall feel of the level for the worse. The puzzles in Grunty Industries that require these characters to work in tandem make the experience more holistic and ultimately more satisfying. I think it's quite telling that Tooie's handling of this one concept essentially makes the difference between a level being its best and its worst.